Okay, well, this is Apostle John Welty with Second Eighth Week Ministries, and today is Friday, May 27th, 2011. And tonight we're going to be talking about the whole stones of the altar of Christ. Okay, we're continuing on. We previously discussed the altar of Christ. Now we're going to focus a little bit more on what it means as concerning the whole stones of the altar of Christ, which we talked about in the previous assemblies there. So when we speak about the whole stones of the altar of Christ, the first thing we want to take notice of is Jesus Christ. Okay? God has not left us to our own devices to function in faith. Okay? He has provided His Christ for our faith. So when we speak the whole stone of the altar of Christ, we're speaking of the representation of Jesus Christ in truth. Now, in order to understand the purpose of building an altar with whole stones, we need to take a look back at the Old Covenant and see God's commandment to His people to build with whole stones. Okay, and Jesus Christ was represented in part, okay, with the Old Covenant, okay, but we know Him in His wholeness and truth, okay, in the New Covenant. But we see types and shadows of Christ in the Old Covenant. So let's go back and take a look at that. We can see this in Deuteronomy 27, verse 6. Which reads, "Thou shalt build the altar of the Lord your God of whole stones, and you shall offer burnt offerings thereon unto the Lord your God." Okay, and we talked about that before, is that the altar sanctifies the gift. Okay, now also we see this in Joshua 8:31, which reads, "As Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded the children of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of whole stones, over which no man has lifted any iron." Now, when God commanded that no iron tool be lifted upon the stones, He was restricting the imagination of faith from man. Okay? God was setting restrictions. This is what we see with the covenant sets restrictions on faith. Okay? It sets restrictions on the imagination. Okay? It also challenges the principle. Okay? Truth challenges the principle. But let's continue on here. All right, so He was restricting the imagination of man from faith. All right, so stones that are taken and chiseled or cut, right, speaks of the introduction of man's philosophies and traditions into faith. Okay, which results in the doctrine of men, all right, which is not profitable for faith. Now, whereas whole stones speak of the purity of faith, okay, as provided by God. So the Jews were not to build an altar with stones that they had labored over. Okay? They were to demonstrate faith by following the prescribed ordered knowledge that God gave through Moses, who was the knowledge steward of the first covenant. All right, so this order and purity of faith was reflected in the whole stone. What God provided for their faith sanctified their faith. All right, so that you can see then that there was nothing that they needed to add to the altar. Okay, placing their own design or their own talent within this, okay, to work only with that which as God had provided, okay, the whole stones. So now that we are under a new covenant, God no longer requires us to build His altar with the stones of the earth, for Christ is now our altar of faith. And we build this altar with the knowledge of Christ. Now, each of the 12 elements of the gospel, and the 12 elements of the gospel are grace, faith, righteousness, justification, sanctification, holiness, peace, rest, charity, truth, regeneration, and renewing of mind. All right, these are 12 elements of the gospel. Okay, each of these elements is a whole stone. Right, and the altar is made up of these whole stones. So the knowledge of Christ must be placed in order by God. So God again restricts the imagination of man from faith by providing truth through apostles, who are the knowledge stewards of the second covenant. Right? These stewards deliver the prescribed, ordered knowledge of Christ so that each believer can build the altar of Christ with whole stones. Okay? As God demanded purity of faith in the Old Covenant, God still demands purity of faith in the New Covenant. Nothing of man is added to truth, and nothing of Christ is taken away. Now we're going to turn our attention to the design of Christ in the stone, right? Or in other words, in the element. The design is for your faith, and it speaks of God's intent, purpose, and goal for our redemption. Right? So now when we say that the design of Christ is in each element, we are speaking about the design that represents the authorship of God. A design is a representation of the altar. Uh, a design is the representation of the author, okay, which we see in each element of the altar. So the faith in God represents either man or Christ. If man has tampered with the design, then faith will represent man, right? But if the design retains the original intent, purpose, and goal of the expression of Christ, then faith will represent Christ. Now, God gave the design of Christ for our faith, right? And we see that design in each element of the of the gospel. So when we speak with the stones that have the design of Christ, we see the author of our faith, which is God, in the face of Jesus Christ. So how do we see the design of Christ in the elements? Well, let's use the element of grace as an example. God provided the element of grace for faith, so therefore the design of Christ is in this stone. Right? The illumination of grace allows us to see Christ. The enlightenment of grace allows us to understand Christ. And the strength of grace allows us to remain rooted in him. We see Christ as the design of the stone, which is provided for our faith and is approved of God. We see God's intent, purpose, and goal of Christ in this element. Now, the whole stones of Christ also speak of the function and usefulness. Now, everything that is made is designed for function and usefulness, right? When we look at a hospital or a library or a factory, we see their function and their usefulness through the design of the buildings. Right? We're not speaking of the outside of the building, but the inside of the building. A hospital was purposely designed to care for the sick and to provide treatment. Right? Its function is only useful if the design remains intact, having all the physical parts necessary for that function. If you substitute the medical staff and the equipment with animals in cages, people would think you're setting up a zoo and not a hospital. So when the design changes, the function and the usefulness also change. So when we talk about building our faith with the whole stones, or the elements of the gospel, we are focusing on the authorship of God in each element. We are focusing on the design of Christ in each element, in order to view the function and the usefulness of redemption. Seeing the function and usefulness of our redemption, we can see the intent, the goal, and the purpose of God in each element that represents Jesus Christ. This ordered knowledge comes through spiritual government. Now, when we are able to accept doctrine that comes through apostles, we come into agreement with the authorship of God and his design of the element of the gospel, as well as with his intent, goal, and purpose for our redemption through Christ. And God approves of our faith. And as we build with the whole stones of Christ, God gives structure to our faith and builds a habitation for the Spirit, which he intends to inhabit. And because God inhabits what he builds, okay, we can again see the purpose of our building of our faith with whole stones, as opposed to with the traditions of man, okay, which alter which they alter or change and devalue the stones of Christ, right, as with lifting an iron tool. So the Spirit of God will not inhabit what God does not authorize. Now, when we build the altar of Christ with whole stones, the Spirit of God is present to both inspire the knowledge of Christ and enforce it, meaning that the Spirit of God recognizes the authority of Christ in the knowledge, as a mail carrier would similarly recognize the authority of a stamp on an envelope. Okay, when the Spirit of God recognizes the authority of Christ in the knowledge that we embrace, then he will carry the work of Christ in the inner man, just as a mail carrier will carry the envelope to its destination. Now, when we talk about the whole stones of the altar of Christ, we're talking about wholesome doctrine. All right? Now, wholesome means that all the necessary ingredients of truth must be present in order to represent Jesus Christ perfectly, with nothing of Christ missing, nothing of man added. Now, as a hospital needs all necessary physical parts in order to function, so also each element of the gospel, in other words, each stone of the altar of Christ, needs all the necessary ingredients of truth in order for faith to function and please God. Okay, and this is what we all want, right? We want our faith to please God, so that our faith will be accepted by God, Therefore, we must labor in faith with the sanctified knowledge of God. Right? And as we talked about, it's the altar, okay, which is made up of each element of the gospel, all right, that sanctifies the gift. So let's emphasize a few things here concerning the cut stones, so that we can learn what to avoid. Now, a cut stone is not a whole stone, is it? Okay, through private interpretation of Scripture, man develops a faith after his own image, which is why we see philosophy and traditions of man presented as truth in place of Jesus Christ, and why we also see the things of Moses in the house of Jesus Christ. Okay, the stones of the altar are cut, and they're engraved with those images. So when the stones are reshaped and given a different form, the knowledge of Christ is given a different meaning. The knowledge of Christ is no longer pure, it's defiled, polluting both the altar and the sacrifices thereon. So if you build a form of faith with these defiled stones, the Spirit of God won't enter into it, because the design of Christ is not in those defiled stones. Now God is returning the church to the purity of faith, and through living apostles, instructing the body in how to build the altar of Christ with the whole stones of Christ, that our faith will be made living as we behold Christ in purity in each of the elements of the gospel. Now our willingness to reflect on the ordered knowledge in its original design shows that we have faith in God, and the Spirit will then inhabit the knowledge and live in us through observance and expression of Christ in the whole stones. All right? And we're going to continue on and look at each of these whole stones, or each element of the gospel, individually. We'll explore each one of these individually as we continue on in this series. So with that, thank you for your participation, for attending and viewing this, and we'll continue on with the next video. Thank you.